The auctioneer's voice cut through the dry Kansas air like a blade through silk, and Theodora Keller felt every syllable land against her chest like a physical blow. 250 acres of prime Keller land, folks, with a working well, a solid barn, and the finest wheat soil this side of the Missouri River. Who'll start me at $500? She stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone bone white beneath her sun-darkened skin. She was 28 years old, and she had spent every one of those years on this land. She had been born in the farmhouse behind her. She had buried her father in the small fenced plot at the far edge of the north pasture, next to her mother, who had died when Theodora was 9. She had bled for this soil, prayed over it during droughts, wept tears of relief during good harvests, and driven herself half to exhaustion trying to hold it together after her father passed 8 months ago. And now Harlan Dodd, with his slick lawyer and his forged debt papers, was selling it out from underneath her feet. 500 from Mr. Beaumont. Do I hear 6? The crowd of Millhaven citizens shuffled and murmured. Some of them would not meet her eyes. She recognized faces she had known since childhood. The Hartley family, old Mrs. Prout, Pastor Cole, who had the decency to look ashamed. None of them were stopping this. None of them were saying what they all knew, which was that Harlan Dodd had manufactured a debt against her father's estate that her father had never agreed to, and that the so-called promissory note had appeared only 6 weeks after her father was in the ground. 600. Do I hear 7? Theodora's jaw locked. She had tried everything. She had gone to Sheriff Briggs, who was Dodd's cousin by marriage, and had looked right through her like she was made of glass. She had sent a letter to the county seat at Crestwood, but the circuit judge was not due for another 3 weeks. She had borrowed what she could from the bank, but the bank in Millhaven was half owned by Harlan Dodd, and the loan had been denied before she even finished speaking. She had written to her father's old lawyer, but he had died the previous winter and his successor had no records of the Keller estate. She was out of moves, and the auctioneer was climbing toward a number she could never match. 750. Do I hear 800? Theodora took one step forward, though she had no idea what she intended to do. Stand in front of the bidding platform, perhaps. Tell the truth loudly enough that someone might actually listen. She had nothing left to lose except her dignity, and dignity did not keep the wheat growing. 800. Excellent. Do I hear 850? It was then that the voice came from the back of the crowd, low and clear and carrying in a way that made people turn their heads instinctively. $1,000. The murmuring stopped. Even the auctioneer paused, lips parted mid-syllable. Theodora turned like everyone else, and she saw him for the first time. He was standing at the very back of the assembled crowd, slightly apart from the others, a tall man in a dark coat that was trail-worn but clean. He had a hat pulled low enough that she could see his jaw and his mouth and the steadiness in his posture, but not his eyes. His hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, not near the holster he wore on his right hip. He looked like a man who had made exactly one decision and was completely at peace with it. Harlan Dodd, who had been smiling throughout the entire proceedings from his position near the auctioneer's platform, was no longer smiling. And Theodora Keller, who had spent the last hour trying not to cry, felt something she had not expected at this moment, something that had no logical right to be present in the worst hour of her life. She felt the first small, bewildered flicker of hope. Theodora had arrived in Millhaven 8 months earlier as its only resident, since she had never left. She had grown up here, learned to read in the single-room schoolhouse at the edge of Main Street, helped her father bring in harvests through the long, burning summers. Her life had existed within the radius of Keller land, and she had never questioned it until Elias Keller had gotten sick in the autumn of 1882 and died on a cold November morning with his hand in hers. Her father had been a careful man, quiet, deliberate, not prone to sentiment or excess. He had kept meticulous records in a leather-bound journal that he locked in the iron box beneath his desk, and he had told Theodora more than once that the land was clear, that no bank or man held any claim against it, that when he was gone, it would pass to her without complication. It had taken Harlan Dodd less than 2 months to make a liar of a dead man. Dodd was a speculator who had arrived in Millhaven 3 years prior with a pocket full of money and an appetite for land that bordered on compulsion. He had bought up parcels from struggling homesteaders, purchased the majority stake in the Millhaven Savings and Loan, and cultivated friendships with the men who ran the town like a farmer tending a particularly valuable crop. He was not from here. He had no roots in the Kansas soil, but he had come to understand very quickly that roots were not necessary if you had enough money to rent loyalty. The promissory note he produced in January of 1883, allegedly signed by Elias Keller in the spring of 1880, claimed that Theodora's father had borrowed $1,200 from Dodd for improvements to the farm, with the land itself as collateral. Theodora had never seen the document before. She knew, in the way a daughter who had spent years working alongside her father knew things, that it was a forgery. The signature was close but not exact, slightly too large in the initial letters, the pen pressure wrong in ways she could not articulate to a court, but recognized with absolute certainty in her gut. But certainty in one's gut and proof before the law were very different animals. She had spent 8 months fighting. 8 months of sleepless nights, reading anything she could find about property law, of sending letters to men who did not write back, of watching the walls of her situation close in around her inch by inch. The auction had been scheduled for June of 1883, and now June had arrived with its brutal heat and its merciless blue sky, and here she stood watching strangers bid on the earth that held her parents' bones. When the stranger's voice had called out $1,000, Theodora had not known what to think. She had not known who he was. She had not seen him before in Millhaven, and Millhaven was small enough that strangers were noticed immediately. He was not one of Dodd's men. She would have recognized those faces. He was not a local farmer, not a traveling merchant, not anyone she had category for. The auctioneer had recovered quickly because that was his professional instinct and called out, $1,000 from the gentleman at the back. Do I hear 1,100? Dodd's man Beaumont, who had been the one bidding on Dodd's behalf, had looked back toward Dodd himself. There had been a silent conference of eyebrows and small nods, and then Beaumont had said, 1,100. 1,200, the stranger had said, without any pause at all, as if the number had already been decided. Another conference, another nod, 1,300, 1,500. The jump had been significant enough to draw a collective inhale from the crowd. Dodd had gone very still in the way that powerful men went still when they encountered the first genuine resistance to their plans. It was not the stillness of calm. It was the stillness of calculation. 1,600, Beaumont had said, but his voice had lost its certainty. $2,000. This time the crowd did not just inhale. Several people whispered to their neighbors. $2,000 was more than most people in Millhaven saw in a year. It was an audacious number, delivered with complete tranquility. Dodd had stared at the stranger for a long moment. Then he had given Beaumont a very small shake of his head. The auctioneer, whose name was Perkins and who was a hired man with no personal stake in the outcome beyond his fee, had cleared his throat and announced with professional formality, $2,000, going once, going twice, a long pause that Theodora had held her breath through. Sold to the gentleman at the back. And then everything had happened at once, and none of it had been simple, because nothing in Theodora Keller's life was ever permitted to be simple. She had turned to find the stranger making his way through the crowd toward the auctioneer's table, and the crowd had parted for him with the instinctive deference people paid to someone who moved with genuine purpose. She had watched him reach into his coat and produce a leather wallet, from which he counted out bills with the deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this moment, or at least thought it through very carefully. Harlan Dodd had intercepted him before he reached the table. Theodora had been close enough to hear the exchange, though she had positioned herself carefully, keeping a cluster of townspeople between herself and Dodd's sight line. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Dodd had said, in the particular tone he used when he was asserting social dominance with a smile still attached to his face. "Harlan Dodd, I know who you are," the stranger had said. He did not offer his own name. Dodd's smile had flickered. "This is a private acquisition. I had prior claim on this property." "Prior claims are argued in court, Mr. Dodd. This was a public auction held in accordance with county law. I made the winning bid." He had looked at Perkins. "The sale is complete." Perkins, caught between the easy money and the more complicated reality of Dodd's expression, had taken the coward's path and reached for the bills. "Sale is complete," he had confirmed, because even Perkins understood that witnesses were watching. Dodd had taken a half-step closer to the stranger and lowered his voice, though not low enough. "You don't understand what you've stepped into." "I understand completely," the stranger had said, and then he had turned away from Dodd in a manner that communicated, without any words or gestures, that the conversation was finished. That was when he had looked directly at Theodora. She had been watching him from 8 feet away, and she had been caught so thoroughly off guard by the directness of his attention that she had not been able to arrange her face into anything resembling composure. She had simply stared at him, this unknown man who had just spent $2,000 on her land in front of a town full of witnesses. He had dark eyes. She had seen that then. Dark eyes that were steady and entirely serious, and that assessed her with the kind of attention that did not presume anything but missed nothing. "Miss Keller," he had said. She had found her voice by instinct, the way people found their voice in moments of shock, reaching for the automatic architecture of manners. "I don't know your name." "Timothy Stone." He had said it plainly, with no ornamentation or expectation. "Mr. Stone." She had looked at him, at the bills exchanging hands behind him, at the land beyond the farmhouse where the wheat was beginning to show green, at the fence post she had helped her father set when she was 14 years old. "I need to understand what just happened." "Something that needs explaining properly," he had said. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" Theodora had considered this. A woman alone, inviting a strange man into her home, would have given the gossips of Millhaven material for months. But the gossips of Millhaven were already talking, because the alternative to inviting him in was standing in the street with Harlan Dodd watching from 20 feet away, which was infinitely worse. "The kitchen," she had said. "The front door is unlocked." She had gone ahead, and he had followed at a respectful distance. And that was how Theodora Keller had come to sit across the kitchen table from the man who now legally owned her home. He had removed his hat inside the door without being asked, which she had noted. He had waited for her to indicate a seat before taking one. Small things, but in her experience the small things were where character lived, because anyone could perform decency for an audience. She had put water on for coffee because her hands needed something to do, and then she had sat down across from him and folded those same hands on the table and looked at him directly and said, "Tell me everything." Timothy Stone had a quality that she would come to recognize over time as his defining feature, though she did not yet have the relationship to name it. He did not traffic in unnecessary words. He said what he meant to say, clearly and in order, and he stopped when he was done. He told her that he had ridden into Millhaven 4 days prior. He had come from Wichita, where he had practiced law for the past 6 years. Before that, he had spent 3 years working cattle drives up from Texas, and before that he had grown up in Missouri on a farm not entirely unlike hers. He was 32 years old and had no permanent ties to any particular place, which was relevant to what he was about to propose. He told her that he had heard about the Keller situation from a man named Gerald Ashby in Wichita, who was Elias Keller's cousin and who had received Theodora's desperate letter, and had brought it to Stone because Stone was someone Ashby trusted, and because the situation described sounded, to a lawyer's ear, like fraud in plain sight. He told her that he had ridden to Millhaven intending to review the situation, and that upon arrival he had spent 4 days quietly gathering information, speaking to people who knew Elias Keller, examining what court records existed, and arriving at the conclusion that Theodora's assessment of the promissory note as a forgery was almost certainly correct. He told her that the auction had been scheduled before he could establish legal grounds to stop it, and so he had done the only thing available to him on short notice, which was attend and outbid the fraudulent claimant. Theodora had listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You spent $2,000 of your own money." "I did." "Why?" He had looked at her steadily. "Because someone needed to." That answer had sat between them for a moment. "And what do you want in return?" She had asked, because she was not naive, and because the world had not taught her to trust gifts without understanding their cost. Timothy Stone had not flinched from the question or performed offense at it. He had said, "I want to take Harlan Dodd to court and win. I want to expose the forgery and recover the legal title to this property and return it to its rightful owner. And I want Dodd to face consequences for what he's done, not just here but wherever else he's done it, because I suspect Millhaven is not the first town he's tried this in." "That's what you want professionally," Theodora had said. "What do you want from me?" The corner of his mouth had moved, very slightly. "Permission to work on your behalf, access to any documents or letters you have from your father, and whatever recollections you can provide about the timeline of events. That's all. That's all, Miss Keller." She had studied him for a long moment. The coffee water had begun to steam. She had gotten up to manage it because it gave her a few seconds to think with her back to him, to assess the feeling in her chest, to decide whether the instinct that said trust this man was wisdom or desperation. She had decided it was both, and that both would have to be sufficient. "All right," she had said, setting a cup in front of him. "Tell me how we start." What followed were 3 weeks that Theodora would later describe to herself as the most exhausting and the most alive she had ever felt simultaneously. Timothy Stone had taken a room at the Millhaven boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan, who had the advantage of being the one person in town who actively despised Harlan Dodd for reasons of her own involving a property dispute from the previous year. This made Mrs. Callahan a reliable source of local intelligence, and also ensured that Stone's presence in town was not dependent on Dodd's goodwill in any way. Stone had set up what he called a working arrangement in his rented room, which meant a desk covered in papers and an oil lamp that was lit well past midnight more nights than not. He worked methodically and without apparent need for encouragement or rest, which Theodora found both impressive and slightly alarming, since she was not accustomed to people who did not require the ordinary human maintenance of sleep and complaint. She had brought him everything. Her father's letter journals, nearly a decade of them. The original deed to the property, which was registered in the county record, and which bore a date that predated Dodd's arrival in Kansas by 11 years. Receipts from the local feed and supply stores that tracked expenditures for farm improvements and demonstrated, when laid out in sequence, that no significant financial injection of the kind, a $1,200 loan would represent, had occurred in 1880. Statements from 2 neighbors who remembered the same period and could testify that Elias Keller had made his improvements with his own labor and his daughter's, not with borrowed money. She had also brought him a small folded piece of paper that she had found tucked inside one of her father's journals, a note in Elias' handwriting that read, in full, "Dodd approached again about the north pasture, told him no. He will try again. He is not a man who accepts no for an answer, and I want this written down because I do not trust what he might do with it." The note was dated April of 1881. When Theodora had laid it on Stone's desk, he had read it once, set it down with care, and then looked up at her with an expression that she could not entirely read. "Your father knew," Stone had said. He was not a naive man. She had felt the familiar grief press against the back of her throat. He just ran out of time to do anything about it. Stone had looked at her for a moment, and there had been something in his eyes that was not pity, which she appreciated, but was not quite neutral either. "He left you well enough equipped to do it for him." That had been the moment, she would think later, when the nature of things between them had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. They fell into a rhythm. She would come to Mrs. Callahan's boarding house each morning after her farm chores were complete, which in June meant she arrived around 8 o'clock, and they would work together until noon, at which point Stone would ride out to talk to witnesses or examine records, while Theodora returned to her land to manage what needed managing. She was still farming, still tending, still watering and watching, and doing the thousand small labors that kept the wheat alive, because regardless of what the court decided about the title, the wheat was a reality that did not care about legal proceedings. In the afternoons, when she could manage it, she would go over the documents again alone, looking for anything she might have missed. She had developed a talent for this kind of close reading out of necessity, trained by 8 months of trying to find the flaw in Dodd's case. In the evenings, sometimes, she and Stone would sit on the boarding house's front porch when the heat had eased and talk about things that were not the case. This had happened organically, without either of them arranging it. The first time, she had been leaving and he had been standing on the porch watching the sunset, and she had paused to look at the same sky, and they had simply stayed. She had learned in those evening conversations that Timothy Stone had grown up the second of 4 children on a failing Missouri farm, that his father had lost the property to debt when Stone was 17, that this experience had driven him to study law with a tenacity that his professors at the law college in St. Louis had described as close to obsessive. He had graduated in 1874, worked in various Missouri courtrooms for 3 years, and then made his way to Wichita, which was a growing city with a constant appetite for legal services and a particular abundance of cases involving land, cattle, and the complex overlapping claims of a frontier that was being organized faster than it could absorb the organization. He had handled dozens of land fraud cases. He had won most of them. He had developed a reputation, which was why Gerald Ashby had thought of him when he read Theodora's letter. She had told him in return about her father, about the farm, about what it meant to know a piece of land so thoroughly that you could navigate it in total darkness, could tell the season by the smell of the soil, could hear the difference between a healthy wind and a troublesome one. She had talked about her mother, who had died of a fever and whom she remembered in fragments, a laugh, a specific scent, the way she pressed wildflowers between the pages of books. She had talked about the years after, learning to cook by trial and significant error, learning to manage livestock because there was no one else to do it, growing up fast in the particular way that necessity required. Stone had listened to all of this with the same focused attention he gave to legal documents, and she had found, somewhat to her surprise, that being listened to with genuine concentration was a more powerful experience than she had previously understood. There were moments during those weeks when she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not quite the way a lawyer looked at a client. Not quite the way a man looked at a woman he was indifferent to. Something in between those things, or perhaps something outside of them entirely. She cataloged these moments without acting on them, the way she cataloged unusual weather, noting it, understanding it might mean something, waiting for more information before drawing conclusions. She was also aware, in the part of her mind that refused to let sentiment override practicality, that this man had spent $2,000 on her behalf and held legal title to her property, and that any feeling she might be developing toward him came tangled with a complicated web of obligation and power that she was not yet sure how to navigate. She did not intend to be foolish about it. But she was not made of stone, and he was a serious and decent man, and the evenings were warm, and the prairie stretched out in all directions with a kind of beauty that made the heart unreasonably susceptible to certain kinds of feelings. 3 weeks into their work, the situation changed when Harlan Dodd made a mistake. Dodd had not been idle during those weeks. He had watched Stone's activity with the constrained fury of a man who expected obstacles to dissolve on their own timeline, and found this one distressingly persistent. He had sent men to speak to the witnesses Stone had identified. Two of those men had leaned on old Samuel Wheeler, who farmed the adjacent property, hard enough that Wheeler had come to Theodora's door with a bruised jaw, and a story about being warned to keep his mouth shut or lose his own cattle to some unfortunate nocturnal accident. Theodora had brought Wheeler to Stone the next morning, and Stone had listened to the account with the expression of a man who had just been given exactly what he needed. "He's panicking," Stone had said, when Wheeler had gone home with assurances that his testimony would be taken properly and his cattle would be watched. "A man who forged a document and felt secure about it does not send men to intimidate witnesses. He does that when he believes the forgery is going to be exposed. He's dangerous when he panics," Theodora had said. "Yes," Stone had looked at her directly. "I need you to be careful about where you go after dark." The directness of the concern, unornamented, had caught her off guard in a way that fancier words would not have. She had nodded and said, "I always am." "I know," he had said. "Be more so." She had been unable to entirely suppress a small warmth in her chest at that, and had chosen not to examine it too carefully for the moment. What Dodd had not anticipated was that Wheeler's account of the intimidation, combined with two other witnesses who independently reported similar pressure being applied to them, gave Stone enough material to file an injunction in the county seat that stopped the transfer of the land title pending investigation into the alleged fraud. This meant that Stone's purchase, while legally completed, was flagged for review, and more importantly, that Dodd's fraudulent promissory note was now subject to formal examination by a court-appointed examiner. The circuit judge arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday in July, 3 weeks ahead of his original schedule, because the injunction had elevated the case to something requiring prompt attention. His name was Judge Howard Crane, and he was 60 years old and had the demeanor of a man who had heard every possible variety of lie and was entirely done being surprised by any of them. The hearing took place in the Millhaven Town Hall, which doubled as the courthouse when the judge was in residence. Half the town attended, because Millhaven was small enough that a genuine legal drama was a significant social event. Theodora sat at a table to the left with Stone beside her, a notepad between them covered in his precise handwriting. Dodd sat to the right with a lawyer named Prescott, who was expensive and who had come up from Wichita specifically for this purpose. Stone presented the case with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. He laid out the timeline first, using Elias Keller's letter journals and the dated farm records to demonstrate that no $1,200 loan had any evidentiary trace in the actual record of the Keller farm. He presented the note in Elias' handwriting about Dodd's approach and Elias' refusal. He called Samuel Wheeler, who testified clearly and without drama about what he remembered of Elias Keller's financial situation in 1880 and about the men who had come to his door. He called two additional neighbors, both of whom had similar recollections about the 1880 period and similar stories about being approached by Dodd's men in the weeks since Stone's arrival. Then he called a handwriting expert, a retired federal document examiner named Clarence Marsh, who had made the journey from the county seat and who examined the promissory note under the court's supervision, comparing it to 23 authenticated samples of Elias Keller's handwriting from the journals and records, and testified in detailed technical terms that, in his professional judgment, the signature on the promissory note had not been written by the same hand that had produced the authenticated samples. Prescott cross-examined Marsh vigorously and with considerable skill, but Marsh was not easily rattled and maintained his conclusions with the placid certainty of a man who had been doing this for 30 years. Dodd's lawyer presented Dodd himself, who testified with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to telling stories that sounded true. He described a private arrangement. A gentleman's loan, he said, conducted on the basis of personal trust, with no witnesses because Elias Keller had been a private man who did not want his financial difficulties discussed publicly. Stone had risen for his cross-examination with the contained energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He asked Dodd to describe precisely how the money had changed hands. In what form? Bills, Dodd said, counted out in the Keller kitchen. Had Dodd kept any record of the transaction on his own side? Of course not, Dodd said. It was a personal arrangement. Had anyone at all witnessed the signing of the note? No, Dodd said. It was a private matter. Stone had then asked Dodd to look at the promissory note and read aloud the date in the top right corner. Dodd had read, April 14, 1880. Stone had then introduced into evidence a single sheet of paper, a letter from the Wichita Eagle newspaper, which had been provided by the managing editor of that paper in response to Stone's request. The letter confirmed that Harlan Dodd had been in Wichita, documented in a published account of a land acquisition deal, on April 12, 13th, and 14th of 1880. The published piece had even quoted Dodd directly in an interview conducted on April 14th. Stone had looked at Dodd across the room and said, simply, "You were in Wichita on the date you claim to have been in the Keller kitchen." The silence in the town hall had been absolute. Dodd had looked at his lawyer, who had looked at the paper, whose expression had communicated very clearly that this was information he had not been given. Theodora, sitting at the table beside Stone, had felt something release inside her chest. Not victory, not yet, but the first sensation of a pressure she had been living under for 8 months beginning to lift. Judge Crane had recessed for 2 hours to review the evidence, and when he returned, he had issued a finding that the promissory note was fraudulent, that the debt it purported to represent had never existed, and that the auction of Keller land had therefore been conducted on false legal grounds. He had further issued a warrant for Harlan Dodd's arrest on charges of fraud and forgery, and had referred the matter to the territorial prosecutor's office for further investigation into whether similar frauds had been committed against other properties. Stone had filed the paperwork to transfer the legal title back to Theodora Keller before the end of the day. She had stood in the fading afternoon light outside the town hall holding the document with both hands, reading her own name in official ink, and she had not been able to speak for a full minute. Stone had stood beside her, not crowding the moment, not speaking into it, just present. When she had finally looked up at him, her eyes were wet and she did not care who saw it. "Thank you," she had said, and the words felt entirely insufficient for what she meant by them. "It was the right thing to do," he had said. It was more than that. She had looked at him steadily, making sure he understood. "You didn't have to come here. You didn't have to spend your own money. You didn't have to do any of this." He had met her gaze without looking away. "I know." There was a pause between them that held a great deal of information neither of them had yet said aloud. "What will you do now?" she had asked. "Where will you go?" He had been quiet for a moment, and she had watched something move through his expression, something careful and considered, and she thought, slightly uncertain in a way that he did not often allow himself to be. "I haven't decided yet," he had said. She had nodded, tucking the land title under her arm, and she had started back toward her farm, and she had not looked back because she was not a woman who looked back, but she had thought about that answer for the entire walk home and most of the night after. The town celebrated in its own quiet way, the way small frontier communities celebrated when the balance of power shifted back toward the ordinary person. People who had kept their heads down while Dodd was present became suddenly verbose in their relief. Mrs. Wheeler baked a pie and left it on Theodora's porch. Pastor Cole came by and said things that were more useful now than they would have been 3 months ago, but she accepted them without saying so. Old Mrs. Prout stopped her on Main Street and apologized, not with enough specificity to be entirely satisfying, but with enough genuine feeling that Theodora forgave her. Samuel Wheeler stopped her outside the general store and shook her hand for a long time and said that Elias would have been proud, And that had been the thing that finally made her cry properly. Alone in her kitchen that evening with the door shut and the curtains drawn. Stone came by 2 days after the ruling in the morning, when she was mending a fence line on the east side of the property. She heard the horse before she saw him and turned, and he was riding toward her across the field with the easy confidence of someone who had spent serious time on horseback, which she had noticed before but was noticing more specifically now. He dismounted and tied the horse to a fence post and came to stand beside her, looking at the fence and then at the wheat beyond it, which was coming along well. "You're good at that," he had said, nodding at the fence. "I've had practice." She had driven a staple home. "What brings you out here?" He had been quiet for a moment. She had kept working because it gave her something to do with her hands and because silence did not unnerve her. "I've been offered a position," he had said finally. "In Denver. A law firm there has been looking for someone with land case experience, and a colleague wrote to me after news of the Dodd case reached him. It's a good position. More money than Wichita, more significant cases." She had kept her eyes on the fence. "Denver is quite a distance from Millhaven." "It is." A pause. "I haven't given them an answer yet." She had looked at him then because not looking at him had become something she was doing deliberately, which meant it was time to stop. "Why not?" He had been looking at her already. He did not look away. "I wanted to talk to you first." The morning around them was brilliant and warm, the kind of Kansas morning that made the land look like it had been designed specifically to be beautiful, all gold and green under a wide blue sky. A hawk was making long, slow circles above the north pasture. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was calling. "I find," Timothy Stone said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words the way he chose everything, which was with precision, "that I am more reluctant to leave Millhaven than I expected to be." Theodora set down the hammer she had been holding. "Because of the case?" "No," he said. "The case is finished." She looked at him, this serious, steady man who had ridden into her life at its worst moment, and stood between her and disaster without asking for anything in return, who had spent his evenings on a boarding house porch talking to her about things that mattered, who had looked at her in those quiet moments with an expression she had been cataloging carefully and thought she finally understood. "Mr. Stone," she said, and then stopped because she was not entirely sure how to proceed, and she was not a woman who spoke before she was ready. "Timothy," he said quietly, "please." She drew a breath. Timothy. The name felt different saying it directly like that, more real. "I have lived on this land my whole life, and I intend to go on living here. I am not a woman who would be happy in a city, and I think you probably understand that about me by now." "I do," he said. "Denver is very far from here." "I know." "Is that the only position available to you?" she asked. "Or are there other possibilities?" Something shifted in his expression, a very careful, contained kind of warmth. "I have been told that Crestwood, the county seat, is looking to establish a permanent legal practice. The circuit judge mentioned it to me, in fact. He said the county has been without proper legal representation for too long, and that cases like this one demonstrated the need clearly." Crestwood was 12 miles from Millhaven, not a distance that could be covered on foot, but easily managed on horseback. Manageable was the word that came to Theodora's mind. "That sounds like a reasonable situation," she said. "I thought you might think so." The corner of his mouth had moved in the way she had learned to identify as his version of a smile, modest and genuine, and entirely unperformed. She picked up the hammer again and drove the last staple into the fence post, and then she turned to face him properly, and she said, with the directness that had always been her particular mode of operating, "I do not know yet what I feel exactly. But I know that I would regret it very much if you left." He had looked at her for a long moment, and she could see that he was moved by this, though he did not perform it. "That is honest," he said. "I try to be." "So do I." He had paused. "I will write to Crestwood today." She had nodded and turned back to her fence, and after a moment he had gone to his horse and mounted and ridden back toward town, and she had watched him go with something in her chest that she was now able to name quite precisely. She was falling in love with him, and it was not the impractical romantic love of dime novels, not the consuming hysteria she had read about and always found somewhat implausible. It was something quieter and more complicated and more real than that. It was the specific feeling of recognizing in another person a seriousness of character that matched your own, a set of values so naturally compatible that being in someone's company felt less like effort and more like coming home. She was also, practically speaking, aware that things had to happen in the right order, that trust built in stages was more durable than trust leapt into, and that she had known this man for less than a month. She intended to proceed accordingly. Stone wrote to Crestwood, and Crestwood wrote back favorably, and by the end of July he had established a small office in the county seat and was riding to Millhaven 2 or 3 times a week on various business, some of it professional and some of it gradually less so. The Dodd case had thrown off interesting complications. The territorial prosecutor's office had found, in examining Dodd's records, evidence of 4 other land fraud schemes in 3 different counties, all following the same pattern: forged promissory notes, manufactured debts, pressured auctions. 2 families had lost land they had not recovered. The prosecution was proceeding, and Stone was acting as a consulting witness and legal advisor to the process, which kept him connected to the case and to Millhaven through the late summer. Dodd himself was held in the Crestwood jail pending trial, and his network of influence, which had seemed so impenetrable from inside Millhaven, dissolved with remarkable speed once it became clear he was facing serious prison time. Loyalty purchased with money lasted exactly as long as the money did. By August, Theodora had developed the habit of expecting Stone on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He would arrive while she was still at her farm chores, and he would tie his horse and pick up whatever tool needed picking up and simply help, because he had grown up farming and the knowledge of it was in his hands still, and because this was, she understood, his way of showing her things he had not yet found the words for. They talked while they worked, which was her preferred mode of conversation, doing something while words moved between them, not facing each other directly, which made the harder things easier to approach. They talked about the case and its developments, about his new office and its challenges, about her wheat and the quality of the coming harvest, about things they had read or heard or thought about. They disagreed sometimes about things, and the disagreements were never particularly dramatic but were interesting, because they thought differently enough to sharpen each other's thinking. One evening in late August, when the heat had broken and the air had that first slight suggestion of autumn in it, they were sitting on her porch, which she had repaired in early spring and which had a view of the north pasture and the sky above it. The sun was going down in a display of color that the Kansas sky did particular justice to, and they were not talking, which had also become comfortable between them. She had looked at him sideways, at the way the evening light fell across his face, and she had felt the full weight of what she felt for him settle into the ordinary, uncomplicated fact of itself. He had turned his head and found her looking, and they had held each other's gaze for a moment that was quieter and more significant than either of them made it, and then she had said, "Timothy, I need to tell you something." "All right," he had said. "When you came here," she had said carefully, "I was trying to be realistic about what I felt. I was trying to account for the fact that you had done something extraordinary for me and that gratitude and love are different things and can be confused." "That's a fair concern," he had said, watching her steadily. "I still think it's a fair concern, but I've been paying attention these past weeks to what I feel when we disagree, which is not gratitude. To what I feel when you're wrong about something and I have to tell you, which is also not gratitude. To what I feel when you drive a fence post better than I expected a lawyer to, and when you know the name of every wildflower that grows in that pasture because you learned them as a boy." She had looked at him directly now. "What I feel is something considerably past gratitude, Timothy." He had been very still for a moment. Then he had said, "I have been trying to go slowly because I did not want to give you reason to question my motives. Everything I did in this case, I want to be clear, I would have done for anyone in your situation." "I know that," she said, "but nothing I've felt since then has been professional." He had met her gaze without flinching from what was in his. Not for some time. They had been sitting far enough apart that bridging the distance required deliberate intention, and he had done it with care, reaching across to take her hand, which was not a small thing between two people who had been as careful with each other as they had been, and she had turned her hand over to hold his, and they had sat like that for a long time while the sky went through all its colors and settled into darkness. He kissed her for the first time standing at the gate of her farm 2 evenings later, when he was leaving and the moon was up, and the night was full of cricket noise and wind in the wheat. It was brief and gentle and honest, like everything about him, and she had stood at the gate watching him ride toward Crestwood, feeling like the world had shifted very slightly on its axis in a way that made everything look different and better. They courted through the autumn of 1883 with a thoroughness that Millhaven found satisfying to observe, because the town had, collectively, begun to feel a proprietary affection for both of them, and to consider itself somewhat responsible for their situation. Mrs. Callahan, in particular, seemed to view the development of their relationship as a personal achievement, and was not subtle about it. Stone came to Millhaven more days than not by September, and they rode out across the land together on Sundays when her farm work permitted, learning each other through the kind of sustained close attention that only proximity provides. She learned his history in layers: the death of his father from a lung illness in 1877, the estrangement from his eldest brother over the farm's failure that had never been entirely repaired, the 3 years on cattle drives that he described without romance as hard and educational and lonely. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the months after her father died, about the specific texture of isolation, about the fear she had grown expert at managing because there was no alternative. He was a contained man in the way that people who had learned self-reliance very young were contained, competent with his own emotions without being cold about them, and she found this deeply compatible with her own nature. She was not a woman who needed to be performed for, or protected from reality, or managed. She needed to be met honestly and treated as an equal, and Timothy Stone did all of these things without apparent effort, because it was simply how he was built. He proposed to her in October, on a Sunday morning when they had ridden out to the far edge of the north pasture and stopped to look at the land, which was gold and brown with autumn, the wheat having been harvested in September and the fields resting now under the enormous sky. He had not planned it dramatically, or perhaps he had, and his version of drama was different from most people's. He had simply said quietly, "I would like to stay, Theodora, for a long time, if you'll have me." She had looked at him for a moment, at this serious, good man on his horse beside her, who had ridden into her life at the worst possible moment and made it better in every way she could name and several she was still discovering. "I will have you," she had said, "for a long time." He had reached across and taken her hand the way he had on the porch that first evening, and this time he turned it over and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and that simple gesture had done more to undo her carefully maintained composure than anything else he had done, because it was so completely and utterly him. They were married in December of 1883 in the Millhaven church, on a cold, clear day with snow on the ground, and a sky so blue it looked invented. Half the town attended, including Mrs. Callahan, who wept satisfyingly and made no apology for it. Samuel Wheeler and his wife sat in the front pew, and Samuel shook Stone's hand before the ceremony with the grip of a man communicating a substantial amount of trust and hope. Judge Howard Crane wrote a letter of congratulations from the county seat that was formal in its structure and warm in its content, and that Theodora kept in her desk drawer. She wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her at the bodice, made of a cream wool that had survived the years in a cedar trunk and emerged from them with remarkable integrity. Stone wore a suit he had brought from Wichita that fit him the way suits fit men who carried themselves with a natural uprightness, without apology or performance. Pastor Cole performed the ceremony with genuine feeling, which was more than he had shown during the auction, but Theodora had decided to extend him the grace of improvement, and found that this decision made her feel better than its alternative would have. When Stone slid a ring onto her finger, a simple gold band he had ordered from a jeweler in Crestwood, and looked at her with those dark, serious eyes, she felt something settle into place inside her that had been slightly out of alignment for as long as she could remember. Not unhappiness, exactly, because she had always had a fundamental contentment with her own company. But something she had not known was missing, the specific ease of being known by another person and chosen anyway. They said what they needed to say to each other, and to Pastor Cole, and to the assembled witnesses, and then they walked out of the church into the December cold with the snow crunching under their feet and the town of Millhaven cheering behind them. And Theodora Keller, who was now Theodora Stone, thought that some endings were actually beginnings wearing a different hat. Timothy moved his practice from Crestwood to Millhaven proper in the spring of 1884, establishing an office on Main Street in a room above the general store, whose owner, a practical man named Hatfield, was glad to have a lawyer within earshot. The Keller farm, which was now theirs together, expanded that year, Stone having the resources to invest in the additional equipment and seed that Theodora had never been quite able to afford on her own. They worked the land together in the way that farms were worked by people who both understood them, with a division of labor that was based on capability rather than convention. She managed the fields and the livestock with the expertise of someone who had been doing it her whole life. He took on the business side, contracts and permits and the relationships with buyers in Wichita, and added to that his legal practice, which in a county like theirs provided a consistent enough income that they were not dependent on any single harvest. They argued occasionally, because they were both strong-willed and well-reasoning and had opinions, and the arguments were always about the thing they appeared to be about and never about something else, which was the best that could be said about any argument between people who loved each other. They resolved them in the same room, on the same day, without leaving things to fester in the dark. In the autumn of 1884, Theodora told Timothy she was pregnant, in the kitchen where she had told him the truth about her father's papers on that first morning, sitting across the same table in the same chairs, which she had not thought about until after she said it and noticed where they were. He had gone very still in the way he went still when something moved him more than he had preparation for. Then he had reached across the table and taken both of her hands in his and said her name very quietly, just her name, Theodora, and the way he said it had contained everything. Their son was born in the spring of 1885, a boy they named Elias Timothy Stone after both of his grandfathers, who was from his first hours loud and definite in his opinions, which seemed appropriate given his parentage. He had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and from approximately the age of 3 weeks was entirely convinced of his own importance, which also seemed appropriate. Timothy Stone turned out to be, as Theodora had suspected but not known for certain, an excellent father in the way he was excellent at most things, through attention and patience, and a genuine engagement with the specific person before him rather than his idea of that person. He learned his son the way he had learned everything, methodically and with full investment, and Elias, who was called Eli by everyone including himself from the age he could say it, returned this attention with the uncomplicated ferocity that young children extended to parents who made them feel seen. The Dodd trial concluded in the spring of 1885, the same week Eli was born, which made it a memorable spring in multiple directions. Harlan Dodd was convicted of fraud and forgery on 4 counts, 3 relating to the Millhaven case, and one from a prior scheme that the territorial prosecutor had uncovered in the investigation. He was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison. The two families who had lost land to earlier schemes had their cases reviewed, and one of them, a widow named Bauer with 3 children, had her land returned to her through a legal mechanism that Stone had helped construct over several months of careful work. Theodora had attended the announcement of that decision, traveling to Crestwood, while Eli slept in a basket under the watchful eye of Mrs. Callahan. She had sat in the back of the courtroom and watched the Bauer woman receive the news that her land was hers again, and had watched the expression on her face, and had understood it in a specific and personal way. She had found Stone outside afterward and taken his arm and walked with him down the main street of Crestwood in the spring sunshine, and said, "You did a good thing." "We did," he had said, and she had not corrected him, because he was right. Life in Millhaven settled into the particular rhythm of a life that is both rooted and growing. The farm prospered in the way that farms prospered when they were worked by people who understood them and had the resources to work them properly. The wheat was good in 1885 and excellent in 1886. Stone's legal practice expanded until he hired a clerk, a young man named James Aldridge, fresh from a legal apprenticeship in Wichita, who was earnest and hardworking, and reminded Stone slightly of himself at that age. Samuel Wheeler's cattle trouble never materialized, Dodd's network having collapsed too thoroughly for any residual threats to find organization. The 2 men who had intimidated Wheeler were charged with assault as part of the broader investigation, and had left Kansas entirely before the warrants reached them, which was not ideal justice, but was at least their departure. In 1887, Theodora gave birth to their second child, a girl they named Clara Elise Stone, who arrived in September with considerably less drama than her brother had, and immediately proceeded to compensate for this, with a disposition of extraordinary calm that made her parents wonder if she had been accidentally exchanged with someone else's child, since neither of them were particularly known for calm. She turned out simply to have an observational quality that expressed itself in silence first and action second, and this made her, by the time she was 3, the member of the household most likely to notice what was actually happening in any given situation. Eli and Clara were different from each other in every characteristic visible from outside, and entirely devoted to each other in the way of siblings who share a household with parents who take both of them seriously. Eli was loud and physical and curious about everything that moved, livestock, weather, the horses, the machinery that was slowly beginning to appear on Kansas farms in those years. Clara watched and thought and spoke with a precision unusual in small children, and by the time she was 4 had opinions about the farm that were frequently more practical than her father expected. The Stone house, which was the original Keller farmhouse, expanded over the years by the addition of a proper parlor and 2 additional rooms, was full in the way that houses are full when they contain people who are genuinely happy to be sharing them. Not always quiet, not always peaceful, but full of the particular warmth of a family that had been built deliberately and maintained with care. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, December of 1888, Timothy Stone gave Theodora the thing she had not known she wanted, which was the original promissory note from the Dodd case, the forged document that had started everything. It had been entered into evidence and then released to her possession after the trial concluded, and Stone had had it framed, not sentimentally but practically, under glass that would preserve it, and he had written on the bottom of the frame in his precise handwriting a single sentence: "This is what we beat." She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had kissed him in the kitchen with considerable feeling while Eli complained from the other room about having been abandoned, and Clara, who was 1 year old and asleep, missed the entire moment with her characteristic serenity. The document went on the wall of Stone's office, where it stayed for the rest of his career, and where clients sometimes asked about it, and where he always told them the story with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who had lived it and needed no embellishment to make it clear. What he did not tell them, because it was not his habit to speak about private things publicly, was what Theodora had said to him that first winter after everything was resolved, sitting by the fire in the farmhouse with the Kansas wind knocking at the windows, when he had said that he hoped he had not disrupted her life too severely in arriving the way he had. She had looked at him over the book she was reading and said, "You did disrupt it, completely, and I would not change one day of it." He had looked back at her with the expression she had come to know as his complete and unguarded self, the part of him that existed below the careful deliberateness, and said, "Neither would I. The years of the late 1880s and early 1890s brought change to Kansas in the way that change always came to the frontier, rapidly and from multiple directions. The cattle drives that had defined the territory in the 1870s were winding down as the railroad expanded, and the open range was divided by the homesteaders' fences. Towns like Millhaven, which had existed on the periphery of the cattle economy, were growing into something more permanent and more complex. Stone's practice evolved with the times. He handled increasingly varied cases, property disputes, business contracts, the occasional criminal matter referred from the county seat. He developed a reputation in the region as someone who was both thoroughly competent and personally reliable, which in the frontier legal world was a combination that brought him more work than he could easily manage, and eventually led to a second clerk and a proper office, rather than the room above Hatfield's store. Theodora expanded the farm in 1889 to include a small dairy operation, having observed that the town's population growth was creating consistent demand for dairy products that the existing suppliers could not meet. This proved correct, and by 1890, the dairy was generating revenue comparable to the wheat, which gave them a stability that single-crop farming had never quite provided. She was good at reading markets with the practical intelligence of someone who had spent their entire life understanding supply and need, having grown up in a household where there was no margin for misjudgment. Stone admired this quality with the specific admiration one had for a competence one did not share, and he was useful enough in supporting it, handling the business documentation and the supplier contracts, that she found the division genuinely satisfying rather than merely functional. In 1891 they had their third child, another boy, named Marcus James Stone after no particular ancestor, but simply because they both felt the name suited him. And Marcus, who arrived in summer and was from his first months the most physically expressive of the three children, went directly for everyone and everything with an enthusiasm that was completely unmodified by caution and kept his parents permanently occupied. Eli, who was 6 by the time Marcus arrived, took his role as eldest with the seriousness of a boy who had absorbed his father's quality of deliberateness, and was applying it now to the management of his small sibling, which meant that Marcus was both supervised and encouraged by turns, which was probably the best possible combination. Clara, who was 4, regarded Marcus with the analytical attention she brought to everything, and was heard to remark to her mother at one point that Marcus appeared to have been made with extra speed and insufficient brakes, which made Theodora laugh so hard she had to sit down, because it was both accurate and more articulate than she had any right to expect from a 4-year-old. Stone heard this account at dinner and looked at Clara for a long moment, and then looked at Theodora with an expression that communicated shared wonder at this small, precise human they had produced. And Theodora looked back with an expression that said, "Yes, I know," and they understood each other completely without a word, which was the kind of communication available only to people who had been paying close attention to each other for 8 years. The Dodd sentence ended in 1892, and for a brief period there was a question in Millhaven about whether his return would cause disruption. It did not. Harlan Dodd had left Kansas upon his release, and as far as anyone could determine, had gone east to some state where no one knew his history and had presumably found legitimate employment or some other form of fraud sufficiently different from land speculation to avoid the same consequences. The town had moved on entirely, and his name, when it came up, was met not with fear but with a dismissive acknowledgment of something that had been dealt with. Theodora stood in her north pasture one morning in the spring of 1892. The seasoned dod was released, and looked at the wheat coming up green from the dark soil, and felt nothing except the satisfaction of the field. The land was hers. It had always been hers, in the sense that mattered. It was more hers now than it had ever been, because now it was also Timothy's and Eli's and Clara's and Marcus's, and it would go to their children after them, and perhaps their children's children after that. She had fought for this ground with everything she had, and then she had been given help from an unexpected direction, and then the fight had become something else entirely, something she had not expected when she stood at that auction block watching everything slip away. She had not planned to fall in love with the man who saved her land. She had not expected to find in the worst moment of her life the beginning of what would turn out to be the best part of it. That afternoon she went back to the house and found Timothy in his office with a stack of papers and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, which was his consistent failure in the domestic realm, the inability to drink a hot beverage before it cooled, and she took the cup and replaced it with a warm one without being asked, and he looked up at her with that specific expression she had loved for 9 years, the one that was his unguarded self, and said thank you, and she said of course, and sat down in the chair across from him to read while he worked. This was the shape of their life, ordinary and remarkable in equal measure. Meals and chores and children and work and evenings on the porch watching the Kansas sky do whatever it intended to do. Arguments about fence lines and budgets and which child had left the barn door open, resolved over supper. Long conversations that started in the kitchen and moved to the parlor and ended in the comfortable agreement of people who trusted each other enough to say the honest thing. The small accumulation of days that added up, when you were not looking too closely, to something that could only be called a life well lived. In 1894, the year Eli turned 9 and Clara turned 7 and Marcus turned 3, and the wheat was again good and the dairy was expanding, Millhaven held a community gathering to celebrate its 30th anniversary as a recognized township. The gathering included a picnic in the town square, speeches from the mayor and several prominent citizens, and a small exhibition of local history that someone had organized with photographs and documents tracing the town's development. Timothy Stone was asked to speak, which he did briefly, and without the kind of self-congratulatory performance that some men of his professional reputation would have brought to the occasion. He spoke about the law, about what it meant to apply it fairly, about the cases that had defined his understanding of the frontier's needs. He made people laugh once, intentionally, by describing his first impression of Millhaven as a town that appeared to have an excellent ratio of honest citizens to dishonest ones, which everyone understood as a reference to the Dodd case without requiring him to be unkind about it. What he said at the end was what people talked about afterward. He said that he had come to Millhaven 9 years ago as an outsider with no intention of staying, and that a woman he had not yet met had a farm in trouble, and that attending an auction had changed the entire course of his life. He said that sometimes the right thing to do was obvious but required someone to actually do it, and that he was grateful beyond his ability to express that he had been in a position to do it, and more grateful still for everything that had come after. He looked at Theodora when he said it, which was noted by the entire assembled population of Millhaven, and she looked back at him from her seat in the 3rd row with Eli on one side and Clara on the other, and Marcus asleep against her shoulder, and her expression was the one that was her own unguarded self, the one she had allowed very few people to see in her life, the one that said "I love you" with complete and uncomplicated certainty. Later that evening, when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet after a day that had been loud and full. They sat on the porch together in the warm summer dark with the prairie spreading out around them in all directions and the stars above Kansas doing the thing that stars above Kansas did, which was appear in such numbers that the sky seemed more light than dark. "You embarrassed me," she said, meaning the speech. "I meant every word of it," he said. "I know you did." That's what made it embarrassing. He turned his head to look at her. "Theodora, Timothy." They sat for a moment in the way they had been sitting together for 11 years, not needing the silence to be filled, comfortable in the shape of each other's company. "Were you frightened?" he asked. "At the auction." She thought about it. "Terrified," she said honestly. "I was holding myself together with pure stubbornness and not much else." "You didn't look it." "I know, I've had practice not looking it." She was quiet for a moment. "Were you uncertain about bidding?" He was quiet in a way that meant he was thinking carefully rather than hesitating. "No," he said. "Not about the bid itself. About what would happen afterward, yes. I didn't know what you were like, whether you would accept help or reject it on principle. I thought there was a reasonable chance you'd throw me off your property." She laughed, which she had done a great deal of in this marriage, more than she had in the years before it. "There was a reasonable chance," she agreed. "But I thought," he said, "that either way the right thing was to make sure the land stayed with the right person. Whatever came after was secondary." She looked at him in the warm darkness. This man who had appeared at the worst moment and simply decided, without drama or ulterior motive, that justice was worth $2,000 and an uncertain outcome. She had loved him for years and knew him now as thoroughly as two people could know each other, and the thing she loved most, the thing she had loved most from that very first day, was this quality, the complete absence of the gap between what he said and what he did. "I am glad," she said, "that what came after was not secondary." He took her hand the way he had been taking her hand for 11 years with the careful deliberateness that was his nature and held it in the summer dark. "So am I," he said. The crickets sang around them, and the stars continued their patient occupation of the sky, and the wheat in the north pasture moved gently in a warm evening wind. And Theodora Stone sat on the porch of her mother's house and her father's house and her own house, on the land that was hers by right and her family's by love, and felt the specific fullness of a life that had not gone the way she had planned and had gone, in spite of this or because of it, entirely right. There would be more seasons after this one. More harvests and winters, and the children growing into themselves in ways neither she nor Timothy could predict. Eli would grow to be a man with his father's steadiness and his mother's stubbornness in a combination that would serve him extraordinarily well. Clara would become a woman who astonished everyone who underestimated her, which was most people, at least the first time. Marcus would remain exactly as he had always been, which was large and loud and comprehensively good-natured, and would eventually run the dairy with a natural talent for the business that made his parents proud and slightly smug. There would be hard years, because that was the honest truth of farming and of life, years when the rains failed or the prices dropped or the world pressed in from directions that could not be predicted. There would be ordinary years of ordinary difficulty and ordinary joy, the kind that accumulated quietly into something worth everything. But on this evening in this summer, with her hand in her husband's and her children sleeping in the house behind her and the Kansas sky above them in all its impossible breadth, Theodora Stone was exactly where she was meant to be. The auction block, the single bid. The man who had appeared at the moment she needed someone most and had turned out to be, in the years after the crisis, not merely a rescuer but a partner in the fullest sense, a person who met her in the place where she was and stayed. She had stood at the lowest point of her life, watching everything she loved disappear, and then a voice from the back of a crowd had said $2,000 with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided, and in the deciding, had changed everything. Not just the land, not just the legal outcome, though those mattered enormously, but the shape of her life going forward, the person she would share it with, the children who would grow up on this soil and learn its rhythms and carry something of it with them wherever they eventually went. All of that, changed by one bid from a serious man in a dark coat who had looked at an injustice and been unable to walk past it. She squeezed his hand in the darkness, and he turned his head toward her, and in the familiar language of people who have spent years learning each other, she said everything she needed to say without a word, and he understood it completely and said it back. The night settled around the stone farm in Millhaven, Kansas, in the summer of 1894, deep and warm and full of stars, and the world was entirely, quietly good.